Today, Beijing is a modern megacity with more than 22 million people. But not so long ago, it was also one of the best preserved imperial capitals anywhere in the world. If you stand on Beijing's second ring road today, it's hard to imagine that beneath your feet once stood a city wall over 10 meters high. And today's busy commercial and transport areas grew around some of the old city gates and neighborhoods of imperial Beijing. Many people believe Beijing lost its historic character because of war. Others blame political movements, and many point to rapid urban development. The truth is, no single event transformed Beijing on its own. But together, these changes gradually reshaped one of the world's greatest imperial capitals into the city we see today. So, how exactly did Beijing lose its ancient face? This is Moot. In this video, we'll explore Beijing's history throughout the 20th century and trace how the modern city we know today came into being one step at a time. But to understand why Beijing changed so dramatically, we first need to understand what it looked like before everything began to change. Beijing's history stretches back 3,000 years to the ancient city of Ji. Over the centuries, this land became Youzhou during the Sui and Tang dynasties, Nanjing under the Liang dynasty, and Zhongdu under the Qing Dynasty. Although dynasties came and went, the centers of these cities were all located near today's Guang'anmen and Lianhuachi, still some distance away from the heart of modern Beijing. The city we recognize today truly began with the Qing Dynasty. The Mongols moved the capital farther north and built Dadu. The Ming and Qing dynasties later expanded upon that foundation, creating the basic layout of Beijing that would survive for centuries. Even as the West entered the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, Beijing still looked much like the capital of a traditional empire. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was still one of the best preserved ancient capitals on Earth, but that centuries-long stability was about to break. Many people assume Beijing's transformation began in 1912 with the fall of the Qing Dynasty. In reality, it started even earlier. The first domino to fall was 2 railway lines. And behind those railways lies a story of an empire in decline. In the late 19th century, foreign powers launched a series of wars against China, invading Beijing twice. The Qing government grew weaker under mounting internal and external pressure, and Beijing drawn into the forces of modern globalization, whether it wanted to or not. In 1901, the Boxer Protocol was signed. It marked a turning point in the city's history. One of its provisions designated Dongjiao-Minxiang, just southeast of the Forbidden City, as Beijing's legation quarter. A 1919 map shows this district rebuilt in Western style, with Chinese residents banned from living there. In many ways, it became a city within a city. Even today, walking through Dongjiao-Minxiang, you can still spot Western-style buildings left over from that era. But the Boxer Protocol changed far more than just one neighborhood. It also accelerated another force that would reshape Beijing, the railway. On that same 1919 map, not far from the legation quarter, you can see 2 rail lines that no longer show up on Google Maps today, the Luhan Railway and the Beijing-Fengtian Railway. Few people realize that one of Beijing's most recognizable landmarks today, the Zhengyang Gate East Railway Station, now home to the China Railway Museum, was itself a product of this period. It was expanded under foreign pressure in the years surrounding the Boxer Protocol. Directly across from it once stood Zhengyang Gate West Station. Today, that station is gone, replaced by modern roads. In the early 1900s, to serve military logistics as well as the growing needs of commerce and passenger transport, these 2 railways were pushed straight into the city under pressure from foreign powers. But there was one problem. Beijing was surrounded by enormous defensive walls. To get the trains inside, openings had to be cut directly through those ancient fortifications. For the first time in centuries, Beijing's defensive system gave way to modern transportation. And once the railways arrived, there was no going back. The flood of people and goods that came with the railways quickly overwhelmed the old gate system. The narrow gateways and the enclosed barbicans that once protected Beijing had become bottlenecks. Over the following years, the barbican of Zhangyang Gate was demolished. New roadways for automobiles were built on both sides, and the two railway stations we mentioned earlier became part of a new transportation hub. For one of the first times in its history, Beijing deliberately dismantled parts of its centuries-old defenses in the name of modern transportation. While all this was happening, a dynasty that had lasted over 2 centuries was reaching its end. After the failure of the 100 Days Reform, the Boxer Rebellion, and the rise of revolutionary movements, the Qing Dynasty finally collapsed with the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. The following year, the last emperor abdicated, and Beijing's era as an imperial capital officially came to a close. Although the republic was first proclaimed in Nanjing, political power soon shifted back to Beijing under Yuan Shikai. Beijing remained the national capital until 1928, when the nationalist government established its capital in Nanjing and renamed the city Beiping. It would not become China's capital again until 1949. But even though it lost its status as capital, the end of imperial rule set something else in motion. The imperial city no longer belonged to the emperor. Under the old dynastic system, Beijing barely had any real public space in the modern sense. Places like Jingshan, the Forbidden City, the Altar of Land and Grain, the Altar of Agriculture, Beihai, and the Temple of Heaven were all royal gardens or state ritual grounds. Ordinary people had almost no access to them. After the fall of the Qing Dynasty, those once restricted spaces gradually opened to the public. Beijing's long-closed imperial city started getting reworked too. Zhu Qian, who oversaw the city's urban planning at the time, pushed to open up Chang'an Avenue, cutting breaches through the southern imperial city wall to connect it with South and North Chang Street and Fuyou Street, while also dredging waterways and building new roads. Spaces that once served the emperor were starting to serve the city instead. As these once forbidden spaces gradually opened up, Beijing itself began to change. Meanwhile, a whole new category of buildings started appearing in Beijing: banks, hospitals, schools, post offices, modern shopping streets. Together, they formed the earliest sketch of a modern city. You can still find buildings from that era today around Xijiaominxiang and the Qianmen Commercial District. These buildings witnessed more than just the transformation of a city. They also witnessed the turning point of a nation. Perhaps no building represents that moment better than the Red Building of Peking University. In 1919, it became one of the centers of the May 4th movement. Students gathered outside the Red Building before marching toward Tiananmen. From there, they headed east along Chang'an Avenue toward the legation quarter, hoping to deliver a petition through the foreign legations regarding the decisions of the Paris Peace Conference. When they were turned away, the march changed course. The protesters then made their way to Zhaojialou Alley, where the demonstration reached its climax with the burning of Cao Ruling's residence. The entire route covered only a few kilometers, yet it connected nearly every major political space in Beijing. And in doing so, it became one of the defining moments of modern Chinese history. From that moment on, China entered decades of profound upheaval, revolution, war, national independence, and the rebuilding of a nation. These became the defining themes of the first half of the 20th century. And when those decades of turmoil finally came to an end, Beijing was about to take on a new identity once again. In 1949, Beijing became China's capital once again. Between the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1912 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the country endured nearly 4 decades of turmoil. The Xinhai Revolution, the Warlord era, 14 years of war against Japan, and finally, the Chinese Civil War. Together, these conflicts shaped almost the entire first half of modern Chinese history. When the fighting finally came to an end, Beijing regained its status as the nation's capital. But the challenge facing the city was unlike anything it had faced before. The goal was not to restore the old imperial capital. It was to build the capital of an entirely new country. For a country coming out of thousands of years of imperial rule, this was completely uncharted territory. There was no playbook for turning an ancient imperial city into the capital of a modern nation. So the country's leaders looked abroad for answers. And there was one country that seemed to offer exactly the model they were looking for: the Soviet Union. Looking back today, it's easy to see Beijing's adoption of Soviet ideas as a matter of urban design. But in the 1950s, it was much more than that. It was a political and economic reality. The newly founded People's Republic had adopted a centrally planned economy, and at the time, the Soviet Union was the world's most experienced socialist state. Its industries, government institutions, and urban planning became the models China sought to follow. As a result, Soviet planning principles began to leave a visible imprint on Beijing. In our previous video about Moscow, we talked about monumental avenues like Tverskaya Street and vast civic spaces such as Red Square. These spaces were designed as the stage for military parades, national celebrations, and major political events. Beijing gradually developed its own version of this urban language. Building upon its historic central axis, transformed Chang'an Avenue into the broad ceremonial boulevard we know today, dramatically expanded Tiananmen Square, and later added monumental state buildings such as the Great Hall of the People and the National Museum of China. But Soviet influence wasn't limited to ceremonial spaces. It also shaped the way ordinary people lived. Soviet planners believed that housing, workplaces, and public services should be closely integrated. Beijing adapted many of these planning principles to its own political and social system. Government compounds, university campuses, factory neighborhoods, and research institutes spread across the city. For millions of residents, daily life revolved around a single institution, their danwei, or work unit. Even after relations between China and the Soviet Union deteriorated only a few years later, this model of urban life remained deeply embedded in Beijing. In many ways, it continued to shape the city well into the 1990s. But not everyone agreed on what Beijing's future should look like. In the early 1950s, architect Liang Sicheng and urban planner Chen Zhanxiang proposed a very different vision for the city. Rather than concentrating the new capital within the historic city, they argued that the ancient city should be preserved, while a new administrative capital should be built alongside it. Their proposal called for preserving Beijing's historic urban fabric and constructing the new government district in the western suburbs around today's Sanlihe, Muxidi area. It was an ambitious attempt to let history and modernity coexist. On the other side stood the Soviet model. To Soviet planners, the political heart of the nation had to occupy the very center of the capital. That meant building the new administrative center around Tiananmen Square. The goal wasn't simply efficiency. It was a statement of political power. In their view, a capital city couldn't survive on monuments alone. It also needed factories, workers, and industry. Following the same planning philosophy that had transformed Stalin's Moscow, large industrial zones began to emerge, including heavy industry and textile factories. Narrow neighborhoods would be cleared. Broad ceremonial avenues would take their place. Chang'an Avenue was only the beginning. In many ways, it was a direct echo of Moscow's 1935 master plan for reconstruction. By 1953, the debate had reached its turning point. That year, Beijing's first socialist master plan had largely taken shape. The government's decision had been made. Beijing chose to build its modern capital inside the old city walls. And that decision meant one thing: old Beijing would have to make way. Of all the changes Beijing went through, none was more consequential or more controversial than the demolition of its city walls. Looking back today, it's easy to see this as a uniquely Chinese story, but it wasn't. In the middle of the 20th century, this was part of a much broader global vision of modernization. Across both Europe and Asia, many cities embraced the idea that modernization meant wider roads, faster traffic, and the removal of old urban fabric. Even the pioneering modernist architect Le Corbusier famously proposed demolishing large sections of central Paris to replace them with high-rise towers. For Beijing in the 1950s, that global mindset aligned almost perfectly with the city's practical needs. The population was growing rapidly, industry was expanding, traffic was increasing year after year. The ancient walls were no longer seen as defensive structures. Instead, they were increasingly viewed as obstacles to a modern city, and so the demolition began. Beginning in the 1950s, both the inner city wall and the outer city wall were dismantled section by section. By the late 1970s, the walls that had enclosed Beijing for centuries had almost completely disappeared. Today, only a few fragments remain: the gate towers of Zhangyangmen, its arrow tower, and a short stretch of the main city wall in the southeast corner of the old city. Yet the transformation of Beijing was far from over. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution brought another wave of destruction to the historic city. Temples, ceremonial archways, stone carvings, and countless traditional architectural details were damaged or destroyed. Many historical artifacts were also lost during this decade. When the movement finally came to an end in 1976, Beijing had been profoundly transformed. Today, millions of cars race along the second ring road every day. Few drivers realize that the road beneath them follows the path of the old city walls. Looking back decades later, it's hard to deny that Beijing was transformed into a modern capital. But that transformation came with an undeniable cost. In becoming a modern capital, Beijing also lost one of the world's most complete imperial cityscapes. If the 1950s to the 1970s were the era when Beijing's city walls disappeared, then the 1990s and early 2000s became the era when large numbers of its hutongs disappeared. The force behind this new wave of transformation was China's reform and opening up, which began in 1978. China shifted its focus back to economic development. And Beijing entered one of the most profound periods of urban transformation in its entire history. The period from 1949 to 1978 created the framework of Beijing as a socialist capital. Then the decades after 1978 created the Beijing we recognize today. A megacity of more than 22 million people. A city of multiple centers, expanding ring roads, skyscraper districts, vast subway networks, and new towns spreading into the suburbs. The 2 decades after reform and opening up were also arguably the fastest period of urban expansion in Beijing's history. The population grew rapidly. The number of cars increased dramatically. The real estate market began to take off, and the city expanded outward at a speed never seen before. Instead of gradually renewing the old city, Beijing began spreading outward along a network of ring roads. This eventually created the urban pattern often described in China as a spreading pancake. At the same time, Beijing began one of the largest transformations of its historic core, and the first to disappear were the hutongs. Open Google Maps today and you'll notice clusters of massive buildings lining the second ring road. It is hard to imagine that only a few decades ago, these same areas were among the densest networks of hutongs in Beijing. Their disappearance marked the beginning of the largest redevelopment of Beijing's historic city center. The land once occupied by hutongs and courtyard houses was given new functions, and with that came an entirely new city. High-rise office towers, shopping complexes, and modern residential communities began replacing the low-rise neighborhoods that had defined the old city. Over the following 2 decades, from the CCTV headquarters to Beijing Yintai Center, CITIC Tower, Soho Modern City, and Wangjing Soho, modern architecture continued to reshape Beijing's skyline. To some, these buildings represented progress. They made Beijing more modern, more international, and better prepared to compete among global cities. But others looked back with nostalgia at another Beijing, a city shaped by hutongs, courtyard houses, and ancient walls. Modernization created a new Beijing, but it also transformed and in many places replaced the old one. Let us return to the axis that has always defined Beijing. The north-south axis begins at Yongdingmen in the south. It passes through Zhengyangmen, Tiananmen, and the Forbidden City before finally reaching the bell and drum towers in the north. For centuries, its direction has remained unchanged, but the meaning of this axis has transformed again and again. During the imperial era, it represented the authority of the emperor and the order of the traditional state. After 1949, the axis was given a new meaning. Tiananmen Square was expanded, and buildings such as the Great Hall of the People and the National Museum of China were built along it. The old imperial axis became the political heart of the new state. Then, in the 21st century, the axis continued to extend northward. It connected with the Olympic Green area, the Bird's Nest, and the Water Cube, and it became a symbol of a city stepping onto the global stage. One axis, 3 eras. Today, when we walk through Beijing, it is difficult to find the complete city walls that once surrounded the capital. It is also difficult to find the vast networks of traditional hutongs that once shaped everyday life. But if you follow this ancient axis from south to north, you can still discover the traces left behind by every era of Beijing's history. It has changed, adapted, and reinvented itself again and again, and its story is still being written.